Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Inevitability Curve. My name is Chris Blask. I will be your host for this. And with me today is a good friend, Rakesh. How are you doing today?
I'm doing awesome. How are you doing, Chris?
If I was any better, I'd be twins, right? So as we were just
Wow, that's
talking about
amazing.
in the green room, right? You've led a sort of fascinating life, and you and I worked together at Cisco in the late '90s, right? You were
Yep.
there just before me, I think, right? In
Yeah,
'96.
yeah. I came to Cisco in '96. I was brand new out of college, and I got into this thing called cybersecurity before we called it cybersecurity.
Right.
And yeah, no, it was good times. So the early firewalls, early hackers, early viruses, which seem so quaint by our modern standards, but certainly seemed interesting and novel back then.
It really was. And as we're talking about in the green room, right, there are these transitional times. And I think, on our topic today, emergency response, humanitarian efforts, and so forth. We can get into your background in context as it makes sense.
Hmm.
But I think along with a lot of other things like the late 90s, like the turn of the century for you and I in cybersecurity and the internet as a whole, I think this period, I think the 20s, going to the 30s is an extremely pivotal time. And I think this topic is another example.
Yeah, I think we are, there's the old saying about what may live in interesting times. I think we absolutely are living in interesting times. And but interesting manifests in many, many different ways. There are, you know, so many challenges that seem very, very big, but there are also a lot of opportunities. And I think that one of the challenges of being a human in this time is being able to see both, to have the cognitive dissonance of saying, yeah, things are really, really hard and things are really, really challenging, but at the same time there's all these really amazing things that are also happening, and to recognize that one does not cancel out the other, but they kind of coexist simultaneously. And how do you walk and hold those things at the same time?
Right. And, we'll see how the conversation goes, but I'd like to, put this in the context that you and I are parents, right? And your
Yep.
kids are maybe 10 years younger than mine. My kids are in their 20s. And we get a lot of people our age, Gen X, boomer type of folks, typical for our age class. We do a lot of this kids these days stuff. And I look at my kids and people your kids' age, and I couldn't be happier.
Yeah, no, it's pretty amazing, and in fact, it's something that's stunned me, and it's not just like my kids as an outlier, but what I've noticed is that all of my kids' friends, the entire cohort of children, and I have a sixth grader, I have a fourth grader right now, and so in that age bracket, the emotional intelligence of these kids is just incredible. The awareness and the empathy, the social emotional context that they are in right now is so much richer than what I recall having when I was that age and my friends. I think that there is something fundamentally different and honestly better about how they're engaging in the world and how they're going to be activated, and like, and it shows up, it not in big ways, right? Like, I'm not talking about like how the kids will go off and make some big change in their community or what have you, but I'm talking about like how they interact with each other, how they call each other out when someone is being unkind, how they reach for each other when someone's having a hard day. There's just some basic human empathy stuff going on, and it seems to be, at least in my view, like it seems to be very cross-cutting. It seems to be cross-cutting across gender and age and in all of the little ways that we might put people into buckets or these kids into buckets. It seems to be very cross-cutting, and I think there's something very fundamental going on. And I'm really, really excited to see who these kids are going to be as adults and what sort of movement they're going to make in the world.
And I want to put this out at the beginning because I think it's important to looking back and really understanding where we are and having a reasonable chance of forecasting some of the paths we may take. But it is that I think we one of the things that seemed like a problem to me from earlier in my life was overpopulation, right? 1969,
Yeah.
I'm 4 years old. I'm watching this little black and white TV, and there's a very authoritative person on the screen saying that the world can never, ever, by definition, feed more than 3.54 billion people. And with 3.52 billion people, that's why 100 million Americans would starve to death in the 1970s. And I'm for, right? When I was a smart little kid and I knew more about math than I should have, but that was just this horrible thing. And we have somehow, despite all the problems we've had between now and then, we make 30% more food per person with 8 billion people than we did with 3.
Yeah.
And I think that applies in many ways to the topic at hand, the interconnectivity of all people, this whole internet thing that you and I and others have worked on, and the results of that, leading to long-term potential very, very positive outcomes that may not always be obvious as we're struggling through, the stages, but I think come out as we consider the whole thing. So let me jump back to the beginning. Where would you like to start as we're discussing?
Sure.
What's a root worth digging up?
Well, I think one of the main themes that I wanted to kind of share with you is the role of adaptation, right? So when you think about the example you just provided, the challenge of feeding everybody, because I remember a time when people worried about a population explosion, and obviously we have something north of like 8.5 billion people on the planet right now. What allows us to do that? And of course, we obviously know that there's sustainability challenges. We obviously know there's carbon challenges, and there's challenges with that population. But what has allowed us to grow that population and keep people fed and seeing this extreme reduction in the worst kind of poverty, especially since the year 2000, has been this notion of adaptation, right? So this notion of, hey, there are challenges that we are faced with, right? Like when we say that we are optimistic, it's not from a place of being naive, right? Like we try and see with clear eyes what is ahead of us and what we are faced with. But then we say, what can we do about it? Right? And I think that one of the big challenges that people have is they go from no awareness of a problem to suddenly the problem is so big that they can't do anything about it, right? They can't do anything about it. And so what we want to do is adapt. We need to encourage people to have this value of adaptation and basically stop in the middle of that freak out and say, look, you're now aware that X is a problem. But before you say it's too big of a problem and I can't do anything, right? Before you remove your own agency, you go from having no awareness to suddenly you have no agency. We got to stop and say, what can I do about it? What can we do about it as an individual, as a community, as a tribe, whatever your slice and dice is going to be. And so I wanted to really spend some time and really dig into the notion of adaptation today with you, and what it means for humanitarians, for public safety, for how we're going to deal with the inevitable crises that are going to emerge in this time, right? So we know that there's going to be crises, but how do we respond to that?
Right. And when we look back, I mean, you use the word tribe, and when I say look back, I mean all the way. I mean, we're here for a lot of reasons. A lot of them happened a million years ago among Homo erectus, forming cultures and so forth, and it is built into us. And in the last, 400,000 or 500,000 years that we've been here, Homo sapiens, there's a lot of repeating structures and social, memetics, thoughts and social structures evolved just like genetics. And we're actually wired to deal with this. To your point, adaptability, you look back over human history, that is the defining trait. That's
Right.
what sets us apart from everything else, is that, whatever the bloody situation is, we end up figuring it out. And one of the benefits of overpopulation, of population that occurred to me early in my life was that, back in the day, 400 years ago, there were a dozen people in the world thinking about things and talking about it and documenting. I mean, maybe a little bit more of that, but not much. But one of the emergent benefits of the internet that I always, thought was pretty fundamental, it was sort of a cliche by the early 90s, is just imagine if every human being is connected, able to communicate with every other one. And that one of the artifacts is you have 8 billion people with some possibility to contribute to an issue, whatever it is. And just on aggregate, is that more or less useful than having 10,000 dedicated people? Quite often, it's much more useful. And this is taking, historical heritage, cultural traits supporting each other and healing the communities and adapting to, emergencies and disasters and climatic things. And we build infrastructure around it. So it's built into us. And
I think one of the really cool things about the internet, and I come from that same time as you in the industry, where we had a very sort of noble and almost utopian vision of what the internet was going to be, where once we got everyone talking to each other, we would be able to solve so many of humanity's problems. And there is a truth to that. Like, we've been able to solve a lot of problems. We've been able to connect the genomic sequence for COVID-19 was sequenced and shared within 72 hours with research scientists around the world. And so literally the mRNA vaccines from Moderna and from Pfizer were actually designed over a weekend. And they were, this was a very short time frame from detection of a disease to actually having a proposed vaccine candidate for those diseases in just a matter of days. And so yes, the internet was fundamental in that, in enabling that kind of thing to happen. Obviously, I think where we might have missed a little bit was the idea that the harms wouldn't also be accelerated. But we have to take the good with the bad and try to hopefully make sure that there's more good than bad, right? And we got to think about, like, what are the harms? How do we minimize the risks so that people can actually maximize the benefits? And I think that we have a much more nuanced and hopefully mature process, or a mature landscape thinking about this now, and at least we're not approaching it with such a naive view. But I think that it's absolutely essential that we recognize how the internet has been a catalyst for empathy too, right? So you have things like the ice bucket challenge, where people wanted to raise money for ALS,
yes,
and suddenly it became this meme that people were raising tons of money off of, and that wouldn't have happened without this kind of instant visual rich communications that the internet provides. In disasters and emergencies, we see this from even like going all the way back to the Haiti earthquake in 2010, where we saw the emergence of crowdsourced communities, people sitting at their home who saw the thing happening on television, and they had, people naturally have empathy when they see something happening, when they see some crisis happening. Many people will just naturally have an empathetic response. But the next challenge has always been, how do we get them to take meaningful, impactful action? And for most people who don't do what I do, who haven't done the things where they've been in disasters and emergencies, making meaningful action has been hard. But the internet enabled thousands of people to actually make a meaningful impact on the ground in Haiti, even if they'd never been there before, back in 2010. And that's where we saw this emergence, roughly 14 years ago. And now that's only continued today, where it's kind of a given that when something happens in the world, entire communities of like-minded people can get activated to go do something about it. And we see the decentralization of mutual aid, right? Where people will say, oh, hey, look, let's do a fundraiser, or let's get equipment to somebody who needs it in this time of, and they don't have to go through those 10,000 people you referred to. They don't have to go through some central authority. They have their own agency and they have empowerment to go do. And so they do.
And let me use that as the pivot to the present, because, and to throw the last bit of the past in there, you mentioned the COVID response. And I think it was the second or third company I sold a firewall to in 1992. It must have been, was the Canadian Cancer Society. And as the person was driving over, to our little office to, talk to me, I did a little Gopher search, and I said, I work at a cancer agency. What's my day like? Well, I'm searching for something. I put in a couple of keywords, drilled down to something, pulled up a list of fresh papers on a certain type of cancer. And the person got there, and I said, I've been thinking about who you are and how this matters to you. And I explained, my thoughts, that someone who works there drives in, they park, they go in, they, look through their files, they find out that there's a paper in the University of Minnesota, for example, they contact the person there and ask it to be, FedExed over or whatnot. And the net was, that was about correct. And I said, would it change anything if they could do this? And click, click, click. And got to just that level. right? And you touched on that, and as you and I know in epidemiology and dealing with a disaster like COVID, yeah, I mean, in 1991, the world would have been the response would have been not comparable. But here we are today, where we have things like agency, ability, just as in this sort of thing. We're creating content here that'll go on certain channels, get a certain amount of views. We're not making I Love Lucy. We're not getting
No.
78% of the American population to watch anything, right? But we have thousands of people who can take agency to make their own content for educational purpose, try to make a living out of it, whatever it is. And in the same way, we can respond to the kind of disasters you've been involved with, including COVID over your current phase of your career. So I don't think anybody else could give us a better view into where we are right now.
Sure. And just by, way of setting background, I've been doing humanitarian response and public safety response for about 30 years. And so my very first emergency I ever responded to was a wildfire in Los Angeles called the Old Topanga Fire in 1993. I used to have a lot more hair than I do now back in the day. And so certainly I've been able to see and witness and actually be a part of the transformation of modern emergency response, where it was very, very analog back in the day, through sort of the 9/11 Hurricane Katrina timeframe, where people realized that without modern technology, they certainly couldn't scale to the level of these major emergencies, these catastrophes. And now we almost take it for granted now that every crisis now, every emergency, every disaster has a digital component to it. Every emergency has some sort of connection to the internet. Now, in 2024, we take that as a given, but certainly when I first started seeing this transition happen around 2001, 2002, that was not yet a given. That was an unproven statement. And people would say, well, why do you need to bring the internet into this emergency? Why do people need cat videos right now? Things like that. But the fact that it made emergency response more responsive, more agile, and more efficient was not yet proven. And so we take these things for granted now, but certainly for those of us who were around for the transition, we remember what it was like beforehand, and certainly what's happened afterwards. And to be fair, I can't imagine responding to a modern crisis without having these digital tools at our fingertips. I mean, I can't see how we would be anywhere near as effective by going back to the way things were.
It's I'm thinking as you're talking there, I'm trying to map those two experiences, because as you say, we both lived through it, but it's one of those things that, even though we were there, I can't picture it.
No,
what exactly would we do?
Yeah, and the way I got involved in this, the way I got involved in emergency response and the intersection of emergency response and technology was actually on 9/11, where I was at the Red Cross headquarters in San Jose, California. And I was, we were, as a Red Cross volunteer, I was basically given a telephone, a pad of paper, and a pen. And they said, people are going to call in with missing persons, take their information down so that we can try and reunite them later. And this is like maybe 2 or 3 hours after the towers had fallen. So people were still very much in the emergency and shock mode of that day. And my very first call was a woman whose adult daughter had worked in one of the offices in the Twin Towers, and she was calling to report her daughter missing. And I remember very distinctly this conversation where she was describing her daughter in the present tense. Like, she works in such and such a floor, she works at this organization. And then in the middle of this conversation and telling me about her daughter, she pauses and she started to cry. And she says, I guess she's never coming home now. And suddenly she went from talking about her in the present tense to talking about her in the past tense. So the realization that her daughter was likely dead and likely never coming home hit her on the phone with me. And I remember feeling really, really, really out of my depth in that moment, because I was just given a pad of paper and a pen, and I was being entrusted with this mother's hope. And I knew that this paper was likely going to get lost. It was going to go nowhere. It was like this huge hope of the worst moment of her life was being entrusted to me, and I knew that nothing was going to come from it because we didn't have systems. We didn't have a way to make sure that there was closed loop communication or anything there. And that's just the system. That's not even the human loss of losing her daughter, right? And so I felt a shift in myself in that moment where I wanted to really dive into this intersection of technology and emergencies, because this couldn't be the best that we could do. Like this, the emotional burden of that moment. And even as I'm talking to you, I can still very distinctly remember this conversation, has really stuck with me and driven me. You know, it's that stuff. And it's individual human moments. We talk about disasters in the aggregate, but they're really, you know, you may have 1,000 people affected by a disaster or an emergency, but what you actually have is 1,000 emergencies, each one unique.
You know, and I know we're still talking about the past, you know, but at that time, you know, the turn of the century, you know, folks may not quite understand. Cisco was an interesting thing at the turn of the century. We built the, you know, huge chunks of the internet. There was a, you know, about that time, you could say that there isn't anything on the internet that's not going across one of our boxes, our infrastructure somewhere. And as you're saying, you know, the opportunity to do things with it. You know, the firewall team, we built this big, massive thing. You know, so myself and others are trotting around the world, and you get down to emergency response. You know, that I experienced at the time was more the cyber thing, right? You know, 9/11. You know, anyways, we had enough of that. But on the cyber thing, you know, you get a vulnerability, you work, you know, put together an ad hoc team around the world and deal with it in real time and have it make a difference. And this is, I think, you know, why we can feel reasonably positive that the future is going to continue improvement on this. We put these things together we've been talking about. We have a generations growing up now who've lived with this, you know, all of their lives, who understand the downsides, that have the ability to capitalize on the upsides, including the agency we're talking about, that have developed, I believe, generationally better understanding and empathy that you really just can't. You know, it's like not traveling, right? You and I have traveled the world. The old cliche: if you don't leave your little town ever, which 3-4 generations before us, no one literally ever did, it's kind of impossible to understand it all. Well, now we have most everyone on Earth exposed to most everyone on Earth, and for all the problems we see, the opportunities to not only address those problems, but to our topic today, to respond incrementally and holistically to emergencies, large and small, in all of our lives. You know, there's, you know, the mental health, you know, crisis as a population, but as you say, every mental health crisis is an individual disaster. And getting support, the kind of support you need, that really can help, can solve all the problems, lower, nearly eliminate suicide and so forth, is just so hard to logistically get. But it, you know, where we are today and looking forward, you know, whether, you know, any one of the crises and, you know, emergencies we want to respond to, I think we have better opportunities to solve all of it.
Yeah, and I think one thing that you're touching on here is really important. We talk about this term polycrisis, right? Multiple crises that kind of intersect and catalyze each other simultaneously, right? And this could be, you can slice and dice this any way you want. So if you're thinking about it locally, you might think about the intersection of the fentanyl crisis, homelessness, and some of these other social and economic challenges that are in our cities, for example, and how they actually intersect each other, and how it's impossible to pull on one thread without pulling on all the other threads in the fabric, right? And so or internationally, when you look at the intersection of things like climate change and modern conflicts, where the destabilization of the ecology also feeds into reasons why shooting wars break out, right? So again, you can't pull on one thread in those areas without pulling on all the other threads. And I think that, like, one of the elements that is really interesting here is that people say, well, if I can't pull on one thread without pulling on all the other threads, why should I pull on just the one thread? And it's because you're actually having the second order and third order effects on these other areas. Now, sometimes they can be good, and hopefully they are. Sometimes they can be bad, and you got to think about, like, how to minimize that harm, right? But I think that we have like one of the amazing things is just our language. We talk about harm mitigation and harm minimization. We talk about intersectionality. And I got to admit, when I first heard the term intersectional like 15 years ago, I hated that word. It sounded so academic. But what really connected it for me was when I realized that we do have intersectionality all around us in how we work. So I was on the ground during Hurricane Katrina, and maybe for the first time I really realized how we dealt with race and class in the United States really had a massive impact on who got helped, who recovered from the crisis better than others, right? And all of these other factors. And so we moved from this language of like natural disaster, and we now say like things like, well, there are no true natural disasters, right? The hazard may have been natural, right? The storm may have been a natural occurrence, but the human impact and the human response to that impact are choices. They're the product of agency at one level or another, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, right? So we might not realize we have agency and so may neglect to take action, which has its own consequence, right? So not acting is an action. But I think that we certainly have a deeper language for describing these relationships, both the challenges, but also the responses and the opportunities. And I think that it starts there. And I think about the fact that my kids, for example, when I was a sixth grader, I would hear, why do I need to study for history? Why do I need to study science? I'm never going to use these things, right? Something to that effect. And I don't hear that with these kids, right? They immediately connect why they need to learn science with climate change. They learn history and geography because they need to understand. I mean, like, I think they understand that they're going to come into this world and they're going to be needing these skills to navigate it. And I think that for those of us who are older and who are in our careers and who've been through these transitions and these crises, the real challenge is actually a little bit different for us, which is how are we informed by our past but not encumbered to our past? And what I mean by this, I have responded to more than 50 disasters and emergencies, everything from 9/11 and Katrina to more recently things like Ukraine and Gaza and all these other things in between. So I've done the range of natural and conflicts and all sorts of emergencies. And it's very, very easy for me to just sit back and say, well, back in the day, we used to do blah, 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 blah. But the trick of adaptation is to recognize that maybe what you did in Haiti in 2020, 2010 is not what Turkey needed in 2023, right? And that if you responded exactly in 2024 what you did in 2009 or 2005 or what have you, then even if it was an innovative back then, it would be missing the mark now. So you want to be informed by all your past and your experiences, but the start point is to realize that we are in new territory now. We are in new territory that may looks like the old territory sometimes, but there's these other elements that are novel and that you are going to have to feel and think and innovate your way into those spaces. And I think that's a really hard thing to do because you and I are both old enough to realize that there are a lot of grizzled old veterans of industry or of service who are very much locked into the good old days or the big win back in the day, right? Their worldview is fundamentally locked in the past. And so while they may have been a rock star hero in that moment and deserving of all honor and recognition for those things, that doesn't necessarily translate to being ready for what is going to happen tomorrow or 3 years from now. And so I think this notion of adaptation and having the plasticity of mindset to say, okay, challenge is fundamentally new. How do we think our way through it? And how do we learn from the past, but like don't just carbon copy and paste from the past?
Well, and I think we can look from the present into the future to, in certain extents, because, my focus, has stayed on cybersecurity all these years. I've been very involved in supply chain and so forth. And, just to, sort of last, call out to intersectionality, Douglas Adams is right, Dirk Gently and everything is connected. The what we need to have the automation, robotics, and AI driven manufacturing and so forth that we all, sort of see in the not too distant future, is, among other things, a supply chain, software supply chain intelligence, IOC, SBOM, and so forth, intelligence artifact sharing system across entire supply chains that is accurate enough to actually be used. Right, we need a attestation, truth, levels of layers of truth to just function. And I think that sort of thing, from that limited perspective, has positive implications about the future. In our sort of cognitive security, disinformation, influence campaign world we're in today, it's easy to get despondent about that set of emergencies. But you can see some structures that are going to go down this path. And you couple with that with, as you're saying, our experience in dealing with, the myriad emergencies we're already dealing with, and the agency and open thinking of these generations coming up. It's hard to imagine that we won't, not only continue to do as well dealing with all these issues, but get a lot better at it.
Yeah, and I think that one of the challenges that we have is just that we have to recognize that the old models may not serve us currently, and they certainly won't serve us well into the future. And so the question I think that we all have to struggle with is, what are the models that, there's a saying that all models are wrong, but some models are at least useful, right? And so I think one of the challenges is, how do we establish the models, the ways of thinking, the ways of acting, that we know we're going to miss things here and there. We know that we're going to miss things because we're humans, right? We're not going to get everything right. But how do we get the things that enable us to self-correct? How do we get us the ways of thinking that enable us to say, okay, we got 80% of the way there this time. Let's figure out how we can adjust and optimize to get that last 20%, or as close to 100% as we possibly can. And when I think about the notion of adaptation, that takes many, many different forms. So I live in a small island in Washington State. We have about 25,000 people. We have a rural public safety community here. Now, historically in Western Washington, you've never had to really worry about forest fires before. It's the evergreen state. It's wet up here. That's the cliche, right? It's Seattle. It's all of that, right? But the reality is that wildfire is increasing here, and it's not the same as it is in California or other parts of the United States just yet. But it's certainly trending in that direction. And so what it's been really interesting to see here is that people who've been here for decades, people who have lived here for many, many decades, and who remember how it was going forward, they're really struggling to understand that the nature of the threat is adapting. And so there's a lot of resistance to things like establishing defensible space perimeters. Like, why would I need to do this? This is, this is silly, right? But the reality is that we have to start these conversations now, because by the time that it's actually germane, if you wait until the threat has fully manifested before you can actually deal with it, then you've already missed the key opportunity of mitigation, right? The key window of mitigation is seeing the harm as it's emerging and trying to get ahead of it, right? Trying to get ahead of it. And so this is a really key challenge for us as a local community, which is, how do we respond to the challenges, the various challenges of climate change as a local community? But I would say that it actually mirrors the challenges of, states and countries, and as a humanity. How do we adapt to that? And how do we do it in a way that's fundamentally empowering, right? Where we decentralize the power and we enable the lowest local action possible. And I think that this is a really interesting challenge we have to navigate, because every time we've ever had a big revolution, like the Industrial Revolution or the Information Revolution or these other revolutions, a lot of times it's been at the expense of the majority of people for the benefit of few, right? It's been a transference of risk. It's been a transference of power from the many to the few, which really enables that elite. But some of our challenges are they cross-cut so horizontally that those models of transference just won't work. We have to enable local action because there just simply aren't enough elite people at the top to fundamentally deal with the scale that's necessary, right? So the old models won't serve us. So how do we deal with these revolutions in our present and our near future in a way that really empowers people to make change where they are and to make systemic change collectively?
I wish I had more time because we could unfold that all day long. And I trying to, think I'm going to resist saying this because it lead to more conversation. But honestly, the what you mentioned at the end, the whole thing about the elites and the difference in resource allocation, is a very common topic. Ask anybody in my kids' generation. It's kind of forgivable when you look back over history because there have not been the resources, right? For thousands of years to have any sort of, the Victorians, I think, did a pretty good job. Where they exploitive and sort of terrible as a culture. Oh yeah, but I think we're getting to that stage where just imagine if you can put those sort of resources on everyone, that everyone had, an assistant who actually knew them well and had their best interest in heart. And if it's an AI, that everybody gets, I think maybe in a couple decades or less. But how does that change everything? How much would it help if, if every person out there had the kind of support that what we call the elite today have?
And I think that, where this finds is we find this in our, I would just call them kindred spirits, right? So a friend of mine is very much, she's the CEO of the executive director of a homelessness organization in Salt Lake City, right? And she and I talk, and she's super passionate about dealing with the unsheltered people in Salt Lake City. I work in disasters and emergencies. Very different contexts, very different missions, very different geographies and people that we're interacting with, everything. But when we talk with each other, what we recognize in each other is that the mission may be different, but the mindset is very much aligned, right? And so we refer to each other as sort of kindred spirits. And what is really, really reassuring is to meet these people wherever you are, whether it's online, whether it's in your real life, however you may meet these individuals, but to just recognize that, look, there are other awesome people working on other awesome aspects of the problem. Because if you're able to understand the totality of the challenges that the world has, if you can actually just kind of hold some version of that in your head, very quickly you can recognize that, oh my gosh, everything is so big that I'm just one person. How can I possibly make an impact, right? Going back to that, from a non-awareness to being completely overwhelmed. But what keeps you stuck in the middle where you can have agency is to recognize that other people are out there too who are just as passionate, just as smart as you are, and they are taking their slice of the pie and they are running with it. And so you can draw inspiration from them. They can draw inspiration from you. I've joked amongst my friends that it's sort of the mutual admiration society. Like, I love celebrating my friends as they do their work in this world. And they celebrate my work in this world. And that's how we keep ourselves going. And so I think that for people who are trying to make that difference in the world, but who are trying not to be completely overwhelmed and depressed about it, I would just say, look for the mutual admiration society. Look for the people who are in your life who are also working on aspects of the problem. Maybe they're just a preschool teacher working with the next generation, which is the most important thing in the world, right? And I use the word "just" very loosely here because it's actually an immensely important job, right? The people who are keeping libraries open, people who are getting healthcare to people. There are so many really important challenges. So you, as a person who has game, you got to recognize other folks who have game too, and use that to sustain yourself, to keep that fire going so that you can lean into these problems and do what you need to do so that we all do what we all need to do.
There's nothing I can say that's going to cap that all off better than exactly that. So let me just thank you for taking your slice of the pie. For my opinion, and anybody else who out there in the world who sees this, take a little slice of the pie. That's the best advice you're going to get. Do one little thing in front of you. It'll make you feel better. It'll make somebody else feel better. It might feed on itself. So
yeah, no, that's how we do it. It's one just step at a time. So thanks very much for the time. Thanks for letting me speak with you, and to the folks out there who are listening or watching. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Rakesh. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again on one of these episodes. Thanks for your time.